Today's occurrence happened in Cleveland, Ohio. When patients went to see physicians at the city health clinic, they expected a routine appointment, whether that just be a follow-up or a full procedure. What they didn't expect was that the facility's safety measures were so subpar that it would lead to a fire so fatal that it changed regulations on a national scale. And it wasn't the fire that was so deadly, it was the toxic gas being released from common medical materials that was so fatal. I'm Tatiana, and this is the story of the Cleveland Clinic fire. Today, the Cleveland Clinic is considered a pretty impressive medical institution, and the same can be said of its standing at the time of this story. It was founded in 1921 and in just 8 years had become a world-renowned powerhouse. It's said that rulers of state, celebrities, and many more went there for treatment, and even though compared to its size today, it would have been considered a small facility, at the time, it was considered pretty large. At the time, the hospital part of the clinic had 184 beds, and the research building for the clinic was used for things like x-rays and other special labs. But its main building was a 4-story building reinforced with brick and concrete. It had dozens of offices inside where doctors had patient consultations and outpatient procedures. And it was considered fireproof. Most of the things happening in the main building took place on the 3 upper floors, and there were 2 elevators and 2 staircases that could be used to get to those floors. But the building basement is actually where most of its vital functions were located or controlled from. About a third of the basement had unused steam boilers, heating pipes, and storage rooms for drugs, supplies, files, and patient x-rays. About 70,000 x-ray sheets, at least 4,200 pounds worth of film. Each of those individual pounds able to produce between 3 to 6 cubic feet of toxic gas. The steam boilers were unused because the clinic just had central heating installed, so they didn't necessarily need them. On May 15, 1929, a steamfitter's helper named Buffery Boggs came to the clinic to repair a leaking high-pressure steam pipe in the basement's x-ray storage room. The leaking water had already damaged some x-ray films, and those damage had already been removed from their storage racks and placed away from the leak. They placed the wet film on top of the storage cabinets to stop further damage. Buffery started doing what he was hired to do. He stripped about 14 inches of half-inch magnesia insulation away and found where the leak was coming from. But he couldn't patch it up. The pipe was too hot to do that, so he went to the clinic's central power plant and asked them to shut the heat off. Before he left, Buffery noted an improvised lighting situation. A lighting situation that the clinic's chief custodian, Walter Adams, would deny being anything other than a, quote, everyday light bulb dropped down on an extension cord from the ceiling, end quote. Just a few months prior to that day, in January, someone asked custodian Walter to do something about how bad the lighting in the x-ray room was. The room had 4 100-watt drop fixtures, which were just hanging light bulbs, but the staff member who requested something be done felt it was hard to see in some areas of the room while she filed x-ray films. Walter decided to put a wide double outlet at the end of one of the drop fixtures. That outlet was said to be able to service 1 bulb and an electrical plug outlet, or 2 100-watt bulbs. Walter would later say he didn't even know that there was an 8-foot extension cord hooked up to the female end of that Y fixture, saying he wouldn't allow it if he knew about it and wouldn't do anything of the sort. The staff member who requested something be done about the lighting would later testify that it was connected to a 100-watt bulb treble light that hung over a big spike and hung down near the film cabinets. Now, all of that wasn't known to Buffery. He just saw that the lighting looked like it was kind of wired funny, but that wasn't his job or his responsibility at the time, so he ignored it. When he came back to that room at 11 a.m., after waiting a little bit for the room to cool down and the pipes to cool down so he could do his job, he got to the door of the x-ray storage room and he could hear a hissing sound. The room felt very warm, but he couldn't smell any odor. He was starting to wonder about what could be causing that hissing sound when he saw smoke. The steam had been turned off for more than an hour at this point, so it couldn't be that. It shouldn't be that anyway. And the smoke he saw was thick and yellowish. Buffry could see it was coming from a steam line near the north wall and immediately ran out of the room and yelled to someone who worked at the clinic to get him a fire extinguisher. He yelled that there was a fire in the room he just came from, and the guy gave him an extinguisher. So Buffry ran back to try and stop the fire, but it didn't help. The fire extinguisher was almost empty when Buffry collapsed to the floor, completely overwhelmed by the smoke. It completely stopped his breath, just like if you shut off a valve or turned off a faucet. And it sounds like he passed out. While he was out on the ground floor of the clinic, a pharmacist smelled something absolutely foul. And when he went to inspect to find out where the terrible smell was coming from, he found a group of nurses gathered around a radiator, having also smelled something and followed it to that same spot. A typist, completely absorbed in her work, was blind to the smell, or honestly anything that was happening, until some plaster or fine powder or something started falling onto what she was working on. At the same time, someone saw yellow dust coming out of a hole in the wall, and a clinic employee saw a puff of smoke coming out of that wall. When Buffry came back to, after a draft of fresh air swept through the room, he started crawling to the open door. Just when he reached it, a huge force picked him up and blew him through the door, across the floor on his stomach, and into a machine room. It felt like a million cushions hit him at once. The previous staff member, the one who saw the smoke coming out of the wall, had just told a doctor about seeing it when that explosion happened. That was the first explosion, and it happened at 11:25 a.m., just 25 minutes after Buffry returned to the basement. There were estimated to be between 250 to 330 people in the building, and it's believed many of those who would not go on to survive this disaster were already dying before that explosion even happened. You see, those 70,000 X-ray sheets in the basement, thousands of pounds of film that each produced several cubic feet of toxic gas, was nitrocellulose X-ray film. It's composed of camphor and pyroxylin with a thin layer of gelatin added so the film could be usable. And it was dangerous. This wouldn't be the first disaster from that type of X-ray film. It caused more than enough deaths to the point where replacement film was available in the market, and an acetate-based film had been sent out and marketed heavily earlier that year. And the hospital wasn't following several other protocols that would have lessened or even prevented this fire too. But I'll get back to that. For now, the X-ray film was toxic when it burned, and it had been cooking in the basement storage room, likely because of the heat, for a while. Its toxic gases had been moving through the piping and ventilation system of the clinic all the way to the roof. Nitrogen peroxide, hydrocyanic gas, bromine, nitrogen dioxide, nitrous oxide, hydrogen, and oxygen gases, all being released from the burning X-ray film and had filled all 4 floors of the building, probably before the first blast even happened. And the blast happened only when just enough of free hydrogen in the walls found a convenient spark. People in surgery died. Surgeons doing the surgery were thrown or collapsed before the explosion from the gas, with scalpels still in their hands. Those who passed early on were considered kind of lucky compared to those who suffered for longer before dying, if you could say anyone in this situation was lucky. Some people looked like they fell asleep. A fire chief said he found a corpse sitting in the second floor lobby like the guy had just started to take a nap when the fumes were released. Others were screaming and crying, crawling on the floors, and found their way to windowsills, faces gasping for air. The dean of the Western Reserve School of Medicine, which today is called Case Western Reserve University, but that university's School of Medicine, Dr. Torald Salmon, would describe the effects of the air in the victim's lungs as rapid and lethal. The gas gets fixed in the thin walls of the lungs. His clinical description said, quote, "In some way not known, the gas gets fixed in the thin walls of the lungs. The resulting irritation makes these cells soluble, and as a result, the watery part of the bloodstream begins to leak through them into the lungs. The lungs fill with water, drowning the patient." End quote. So, they're drowning, but not just drowning. The coroner reports noted anyone who died from poison had bubbling around their nose and mouth. A Roy Miller and a W. Johnson, who I'll call W, were on 40-foot ladders painting a sign west of the clinic when they heard that first blast. Then W saw what he described as a dense cloud of umber smoke spilling from the building. Roy and W ran with their ladders all the way to the clinic and joined another guy named Walter Jackson in getting people out of the second floor. They saw dozens of people screaming and hanging onto the windowsills to try and get away from the gas. Frank Salvini and Bruce Griffith joined W., Roy, and Walter in bringing injured second-floor victims down the ladders one by one. Well, minus Walter, who one witness said was carrying people two at a time down the ladder as easy as just one person would go down the stairs. And honestly, Walter was kind of superhuman with it. The gas and heat stopped rescuers from getting close enough to maneuver their ladders to the second-floor windows, so Walter held ladders up with his hands and shoulders while rescuers carried bodies down it. One witness said, quote, "I saw him hold up a ladder, full of people, with the strength God gave no human being. When he could stand that no longer, he staggered to the side of the victims on the ground, tearing off his shirt to wrap around a naked person." End quote. A guy known as Jimmy ran into the clinic after saying it looked like gas, and he was going in before returning outside with a body, and then turning around to go do the same thing again. Students from a commercial school came to help too. They went in and started pulling victims out, even though firemen told them not to. A patrolman, Ernest Staub, also heard the commotion and rushed to the clinic. Ernest pulled out 21 bodies from the building before collapsing, and his good deeds didn't go completely unpunished. He had fainting spells for months afterwards. Years later, he would go on to rescue 3 children from the path of a drunk driver. I believe there were some reports saying that he collapsed on his lawn after this incident happened and died, but it seems like he was hospitalized after that collapse and continued to work as an officer for a couple more decades. Survivors and those on scene afterwards described the faces of the dead as being green, blue, yellow, or yellowish-brown in color. An unlucky but lucky to survive doctor who was vacationing and stopped by the clinic in Cleveland was in another building when the first explosion happened. Hearing that blast, he rushed to the building to see what happened and probably to help, but what he saw left him totally speechless. He said, quote, "It was too horrible to describe. That gas is awful stuff. It bites into the skin like acid, worse than acid, because acid at least is localized. This gas eats into the tissues and eats and eats and eats. Her mouth was bleeding. Her eyes and nose were bleeding. She couldn't speak." End quote. Some patients died in their spouse's arms. Florence Epstein was one of them. On the second and third floors, the situation was likely worse. Everything so far had caught patients in various states of undress as they might have been changing into examination gowns or back into their own clothing. After the explosion, nurses and doctors tried to get those same patients out of the building safely. Dr. Wilson Pert, the head of the clinic's dental wing, was treating patients on the third floor when the first explosion happened. He tried to stop patients from going into the hall, but it didn't work. Many still tried to leave, including his assistant and a technician who would end up dying. Dr. Pert managed to drag multiple patients back into the room, though, and opened windows. Dr. Pert and physician Wallace Duncan refused to leave until firemen rescued all 18 other people in the room with them. And they weren't the only clinic staff considered heroic. The head of the art and photography department had taken the day off, but happened to return to the Cleveland Clinic to retrieve a forgotten item. His name was William Brownlow, and he was on the third floor in his studio when everything went down. He was suffering from the gas when the clinic usher, Susan Brantweiner, ran in. William tried to smash a window while Susan crawled across the floor towards him and told William goodbye. William told her this was not goodbye for her and smashed the window before throwing Susan through it outside. William refused to leave his studio until 2 other victims had been rescued from his room, and he died soon after. Susan was eventually rescued by firefighters. A nurse in the Lakeside unit, Edith Morgan, was working as a receptionist in that main waiting room. Edith tried to calm down hysterical patients and help them get out. Later, she went to the hospital building where she continued to help care for victims until she collapsed. Gladys Gibson, the clinic telephone operator, died at her desk, with the cords on her switchboard plugged into the lines throughout the building. Gladys stayed at her post to alert others to the emergency, even though she sat just a few feet away from a window that she could have easily escaped from. Now, while Dr. Pert and Wallace Duncan were able to bring back some patients that tried to escape, many patients wanted to evacuate through the stairways and elevators. The rear elevator and stairwell were already on fire. Gases were focusing on the interior court, making side rooms safer and meaning people should wait for rescue in those rooms via the windows. But obviously they didn't know that at the time. So victims would later be found in piles by the staircase and the doors of the second and third floor elevator. They became so desperate, on the third floor that the metal doors of the elevator were found partially pushed in, and in those warped metal doors were the feet of a man in a wheelchair who was forced through the gaping hole. They literally warped metal and shoved a disabled man through it. That's how panicked they were. One coroner actually believed that some people died from, being scared to death. One guy jumped to his death from the fourth floor window. Apparently, life nets were set up to be used, but hardly anyone jumped out of the windows. It's said many of the dead were found on the third floor. A stair door to that floor was held open by a foot latch, and it allowed the toxic gas to build up much heavier there. It's said that the gas was especially thick on that floor. 80 of the dead were patients or clinic visitors. The rest of the fatalities were employees, at least 8 of which were 8 doctors and 6 nurses, appearing to have died while they were trying to save their patients. One of those healthcare workers was one of the 4 founders of the clinic itself, Dr. John Phillips. Dr. Phillips worked outside treating victims for hours on the grass. Just about everyone who was brought out of the building was examined by clinic physicians before being sent to the hospital in every available vehicle possible. Later that evening, Dr. John Phillips collapsed in his apartment and died. Another founder of the clinic, Dr. George Cryle Sr., who had been performing surgery in a different building, said that the building was a crucible. And quote, "I saw nothing in France so terrible." George Sr., Frank Bunce, and William Lowther had served together in Cleveland's Lakeside Medical Unit in France during World War I and was inspired by how medical teams worked together and the techniques they used to treat mass medical casualties on the Western Front. Dr. John Phillips, the one who later died in his apartment, joined their venture, and they modeled it after the Mayo Clinic, another world-renowned facility. The injuries the founding men were seeing during their triage attempts during the Cleveland Clinic fire were similar to what they saw in World War I. A second, way more powerful explosion happened 8 to 10 minutes after the first firemen arrived on scene and would blow Buffrey Boggs into a window well in the basement of the clinic. From there, he and a companion got out of the building. Then Buffrey Boggs moved his car before running to a fire station and yelling that there's a terrible fire at the clinic, a big fire. The first fire alarm was raised regarding that fire at 11:30 a.m., just 5 minutes after the explosion. A third explosion happened soon after the second one. When the firemen made their way to the clinic, they spotted dense yellow-brown gas blocks before they made it to the actual building, and they could smell it before making it there too. Because they could smell and see this funny-looking gas, they had masks on before they made it to the clinic, but it didn't seem like in most cases the gas mask held up to the fumes. So they tried to use oxygen helmets in some cases, but if it wasn't fitted properly, it obviously didn't help. And in many cases, it wasn't fitted properly. Now, that second explosion at the clinic blew out a lot of the windowsills still in place and the roof skylight. It also put several other holes in the roof. It was kind of helpful in the way that the windows being out of the way let firemen actually see into the building better and spot victims previously hidden by smoke. They actually had no idea that there were so many people in the building until that moment. The fire started during the clinic's busiest time of day. But no windows also helped to quickly vent the building. Firemen were able to lower through those blown-out skylights into the building after taking a motorized ladder to the roof. That's where they were able to pull out victims from the stairwell and elevator. 2 firemen, Howard McAllister and Peter Roger, managed to send 15 people to the roof. Some of them were already dead, but there were a few people able to be revived. By 1:15 p.m., it was all over. Except for a few window frames and part of the roof still smoldering, all of the fire had been put out and all of the victims had been removed from the clinic. There were so many remains that the morgue kind of ran out of room and had to lay out people on the floor for identification. But that wasn't the end of it. Not for those who survived, at least initially. A lot of the initial survivors fought death for hours, days, weeks. One attorney, Henry Lustig, fought to stay alive for a month after the fire. Henry went with his father-in-law into the clinic that day. When that first blast happened, it hit them both. Henry tried to save his father-in-law, and he later stayed inside to help several trapped women. Survivors who gave newspaper interviews after the fire were seen in later prints as being part of the fatalities. The clinic's official death toll was 123 people, originally 121, but counting people like Henry who passed after the initial incident, the real total is 128 people. About 50 people were also treated in hospitals from the gas or falling glass or something like that. Some of those people were later added to the death count, but no one died outright due to the explosions or the fire. Within days of this tragedy, investigations were underway. I hinted at some things that are believed to have led to this earlier, but what was revealed made this disaster seem all the more preventable. A lot of the witnesses who saw the alleged wrongdoing done in the clinic weren't willing to come forward and testify in public, so the coroner concluded during a private investigation that there was no need to have a grand jury investigation or place blame for the fire. No one was found individually liable, but everyone agreed it never should have happened. The clinic did do its own investigation, along with the National Fire Protection Association, and the Fire Protection Association figured that there were 3 possibilities. The first, the overheating in the storage room led to the spontaneous combustion of the dangerous X-ray film. According to the fire report, steam at 65 pounds pressure is about 312 degrees Fahrenheit. The film starts to break down at around 275 degrees Fahrenheit, or 135 degrees Celsius. The film closest to the leak was in the corner that Buffry first saw the cloud of smoke. The second possibility being that Buffry Boggs, or more generally speaking, someone carelessly left a cigarette or a match in the basement. There was a lot of speculation about Buffry leaving a cigarette in the room, lots of questions about his smoking habits, and the works. They wondered if Buffry smoked a cigarette or 2 while stripping the steam pipe. Everyone was interrogated about their own smoking habits and if they saw anyone smoking near the film room. They were asked what they knew about Buffry's smoking habits, and while Buffry did admit to being a moderate smoker, the city investigators noted that during Buffry's testimony, he appeared to be an incessant cigarette smoker. But again, no evidence that Buffry smoked in the film room on May 15th was ever found. The third possibility, and most accepted, was the alleged jerry-rigged light in the basement was the cause. They believed it was possible that the film caught fire from touching the extension cord light dropped over the big spike near the film racks. The heat from the light bulb could have triggered the breakdown of film, leading to everything that happened after. Now, despite a chairwoman, Rose Rebar, who testified to seeing people smoke in the basement often, there was apparently no proof of anyone smoking in there the day of the fire. And even though Fire Warden J.H. Andrews found a pack of cigarettes in the film room during an inspection he performed in there just 5 days before the fire, no tobacco evidence was found. So, tossing the smoking theory aside, by Buffry or anyone else who may have snuck in there to smoke while he was gone and didn't or couldn't come forward after about it, we're left with the 2 other theories. One being how hot the room was triggering the fire, but even though the report suggested that it's possible the steam was hot enough to cause that to happen, a lot of investigators believe that the heat from those pipes just didn't seem plausible enough to ignite the X-ray, no matter how warm the room was. So that really left the dangling light bulb, the one that the chief custodian, Walter Adams, claimed he had no knowledge of being there, or even that it wasn't there at all, even though it was there for several months, and it was found in the wreckage of the storage room. He even went on to say, quote, "As for that light bulb extension, if it was there after the fire, Ghost must have placed it there. We took special pains that the 100-watt bulbs were not within 3 feet of the X-ray films." End quote. He also denied what literally all the fire investigators and their official report said about the fire door of the film room not being able to close. Quote, "We closed it every night. It was left open in the daytime so the room could have the same temperature as the rest of the building." End quote. With that specific door, the counterweight lever was caught on a steam pipe, so it wasn't able to close. The fire door between the elevator hall and the machine room was also unable to close. That counterweight on that door was jammed between the upper hinge and the wall. The fire door between the stairs and the elevator hall was kept open with a barrel. The failure of those 3 fire doors properly closing allowed the gas to travel into the stairs and elevator shafts, the most fatal areas. But in the report, it mentioned that even if they had closed, the loss of life probably wouldn't have been significantly less because the film room was not vented properly and it didn't have automatic sprinklers. The fire door and entrance to the tunnel leading to the boiler house closed properly, which stopped the gas from spreading to the hospital and other buildings on campus. So that fire door working properly is believed to have saved lots of lives. Even though several fire doors didn't necessarily do the job they were installed to do, they all withstood the fire, only needing to be repainted. 10 covered wired glass doors on the southwest corner of the building held up but needed to be replaced. If they were closed, they stopped fire damage, especially on the first, second, and fourth floors. The stair door on the third floor, as I mentioned earlier, was held open by a footlatch that allowed the fire in the rear stair shaft to reach the third floor. On May 24th, a newspaper said that one of the chief witnesses in the city investigation made false statements and that those false statements were about the lights in the basement room. On June 12th, the National Fire Protection Association released their report that lit up the clinic and the city for how sloppy they were in regulating and handling X-ray films. Quote, "It is inconceivable that the conditions responsible for the Cleveland hospital disaster could have been permitted to exist for even a single day had the management of inspection authorities appreciated the hazard. The physical facts are well established. There was a large quantity of nitrocellulose X-ray film in the basement. It was stored in obvious violation of proper precautions for the keeping of this material of known dangerous property." End quote. Investigations into the effects of this gas were extensive following this fire. The War Department and Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine tested on mice and rabbits. Mice exposed to the residue scrapings from the walls of the clinic died within 1 to 2 minutes, convulsing. In lesser concentrations, the gas caused difficulty breathing that usually leads to a bluish discoloration of the skin and mucous membranes caused by low oxygen levels in the blood. It was found that the gases were pretty much what caused most of the deaths. The fire itself didn't cause nearly as much loss of life, if any, as is pretty much on par with normal fires. Smoke causes more than half of all deaths from fire-related casualties. In the clinic fire, about 30% of the gases from the X-ray film were carbon monoxide, obviously fatal, and nitrogen peroxide was like another 30% of the gases and heavily contributed to death because it's corrosive to human tissue. Even small amounts can cause illness and headaches. Like some authorities say that breathing in just 1% of the gas will kill you. It dissolves to form nitric acid and nitrous acid together, and that's what burns human tissue. Now, having said that, it sounds like a fire hose or sprinklers wouldn't have helped. And yes, nitrocellulose can keep burning even when immersed in water, but according to fire reports, water would have absorbed a large amount of the nitrous fumes and significantly reduced the amount of other gases because they would have cooled to below ignition point. It seems like it would have decreased the amount of toxic gas that accumulated. But the Cleveland Clinic at the time pretty much did the best it sort of could to move past the tragedy, for lack of a better way to phrase that. They switched to acetate-based film and enforced some X-ray film-related safety recommendations and regulations. They rebuilt the main building on a different floor plan so that it looked and felt different to help people not be painfully reminded of that day anytime they came into the facility. And it's said that insurance claims were paid off. To this day, it's a wonder to me how, after not following inspection orders multiple times, they weren't shut down or something, or how the fire warden wasn't made responsible for not enforcing the order more thoroughly. Although it's completely possible that fire laws and fire warden powers and such were different in 1929. But I mean, to not even find the clinic, it's interesting to say the least. Especially considering possibly the worst part about this was that this was far from the first time something like this happened because of that specific type of X-ray film. In September of 1924, gases that came from burning X-ray film pushed through the ventilation system at a Syracuse hospital and overwhelmed victims. In March of 1928, another hospital had the same thing happen and it killed 8 people. Those incidents were why the new acetate-based film were marketed that year and told to be used as a replacement. Most other medical facilities stored their X-rays in metal containers like they were supposed to. The Cleveland Clinic didn't. They had some stored in metal filing cabinets, but many of them were in open wooden racks, and all of the films were stored in flammable paper or manila folders. Many other large facilities had sprinkler systems in their storage rooms. The Cleveland Clinic didn't, and the room wasn't properly vented either. The lack of air in the room prevented the fire from free burning and caused more gas to develop. There also weren't sprinklers anywhere else in this apparent fireproof building. They didn't store the x-ray films in an area away from patient areas, like isolated from them, even though apparently the clinic did have a huge amount of x-ray films stored on the first floor in a room enclosed by tile partitions, with the passageway to that hallway protected by an approved fire door. Fire didn't get into that room. Lastly, in the clinic's main building, the ventilation system was located in the x-ray storage room, which is why the whole building was filled with gas. I mean, it was just bad all around, in my opinion. Like, it's one thing, not an acceptable one thing, but it is one thing to ignore inspection orders and store things in a grossly unsafe, if not full-on negligent way. But to have several of the same exact incidents happen leading up to this, I'm side-eyeing the fire warden and everyone else who, in my opinion, didn't do enough to stop this from happening. Like, the National Fire Protection Association said, quote, "The most diabolical cunning could scarcely have devised an arrangement more surely calculated to spread death throughout the building." End quote. Obviously, this disaster didn't ruin the Cleveland Clinic. Today, it is one of the best hospitals in the world for cardiology, heart and vascular surgery, and has international operations worldwide. It's a leader for research, education, and health information. It's a nonprofit. It started that way, and it's still that way. According to Case Western University, after the disaster, the Cleveland Clinic set up temporary headquarters in a former dormitory that was across the street, and community leaders and more donated gifts amounting to over $30,000, which is almost $569,000 today. All of that money was poured in to help rebuild, but the Cleveland Clinic chose to return the money with interest and financed its own recovery. By Friday, the same week of the fire, one of the founders, Dr. George Kreil, was back in the operating room saying, "Grief would be defeat. This has come to us, and we must build something constructive of it." In the end, Cleveland Clinic officials were not made legally responsible, and even though their clinic was hit with about $3 million in lawsuits, they settled out of court for about $45,000. The City Managers Commission recommended that Cleveland police and fire departments be supplied with gas masks and to start a municipal ambulance service for more fitting transportation for emergency cases needing hospital care, considering during this disaster, they lacked having nearly enough medical transport vehicles. Fire insurance companies revised and strictly enforced safety regulations having to do with the storage of materials like nitrocellulose film. And nationwide, there were new standards developed for labeling and storing hazardous materials, especially the ones involved in this disaster. If you like deep dives into events like this, don't forget to subscribe or follow from wherever you're listening from. Stay safe, and see you next Thursday. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.